everyone, and welcome to the Lens Deconstructed podcast. This is a podcast where we come together to discuss the Bible and explore the lens of the ancient authors. My name is Daniel Owen, and I'm a journalist.
My name is Brent Eisen. I am a truck driver and also a Bible nerd.
We're just two average guys with a serious interest in the Bible and a whole lot of questions. Each week, we will examine passages and topics and try to deconstruct the lenses we often use to understand them.
We want to be an information hub for those of us who want to learn more about the Bible from the perspective of ancient Israel and first century Judea, or to discuss the language, history, culture, geography, and spiritual worldviews found in the Bible.
Lastly, at the Lens Deconstructed, we neither have all the answers, nor do we want you to make our theology your own. Instead, we are here to empower you with the tools and context to better understand who God is and what exactly He expects from each of us.
So if you are interested in joining us on our journey, we would like to welcome you to the Lens Deconstructed. Hey everyone, this is Brent Eisen here, back with Daniel Owens, halfway across the world, and we are going to be picking up where we left off last time. We did a 30,000 feet view of the Passover meal that they had in Exodus. Being this time of year, we really wanted to touch on this. I know that it excites me and Daniel both. This is a topic that we've both looked into for so many years, and actually been taught hand in hand with our pastor, Rick Struckle. Actually, he does a Passover Seder every meal to kind of reenact that and some of what the Jews would do in their own homes there. So today we're going to be zooming in on one particular topic. So without further ado, I guess the question to Daniel is to pass over or to not pass over?
Oh, gosh. Okay. Yeah. We always talk about definitions first. So we have a term in English that we call Passover. We have this phrase. It's a translation from a Hebrew word Pesach, Pesach. If you were to transliterate it, Pesach with a ch sound at the end. And Pesach has long traditionally been translated into English as to pass over or Passover, in the sense that a lot of your traditional texts will read that the angel of death, or that God passed over the homes where He saw the blood, right? So remember, we're talking about the story of Exodus chapter 12, where God had commanded the Israelites to put the blood of the spotless lamb over their doorposts, and when He would see that blood, no death would come into their home, and thus the next day the exodus out of Egypt would commence, and they would be freed and liberated from their oppression. So this is the backdrop, right? So this word Passover or Pesach that we get, it's very interesting. We Brent mentioned we're going to go from 30,000 feet to maybe zoom in and roll tight here, but I think it's important. This is so much is tied up in the words that we use and the definitions that we give to those words. And so I think it's worth it to do this. So I wanted to look real quick at the word Pesach and sort of discuss, is there a different meaning than what's traditionally been understood? And if so, is that meaning valuable to us as we look at the text, as we want to study this historical festival, this feast day? This day that we see foreshadowed in the Old Testament about a New Testament promise. And so I wanted to look at this quickly. If you read in Exodus chapter 12, verse 13, and I'm going to read to you from what's called the Septuagint. So we've talked about this before, but briefly recapping, around 200 to 300 years before Christ, you have a city in northern Egypt called Alexandria. This city had a very large Jewish population, and that Jewish population spoke Greek. In Alexandria at the time, that was the language. And so this Jewish Greek-speaking population desperately wanted to have a copy of the Old Testament, we'll call it, in their language, their spoken language, that of Greek. So at that point, as far as we know, there had been no translations of the Old Testament into any other language. It was always in Hebrew. And so they got permission from Jerusalem, and there were, the story goes, there were 70 rabbis or translators or Torah sort of professional, we'll call them lawyers in the sense of language experts, who came and they each worked on this translation. That's called in the Greek Septuagint, essentially meaning 70, from the 70 folks who came down to work on it. And this was translated into Greek, and that's what we have this available to us today. Now, what's the benefit of that? As we mentioned before, having this Greek translation gives us a point of reference, because the Hebrew translation, we often call the Masoretic, the oldest known copy is 800 years after Christ, right? So it's around 800 AD is the earliest copy. Now, what that means is we can look back at the Greek, and we can examine that Greek and see, are there any differences? Are there any distinctions? And oftentimes there are. They're typically subtle. You're not going to find completely different stories going on. But sometimes those subtle differences can be quite meaningful. And in this case, we're not talking about different words used. We're talking about the definitions of words. So if you were to translate, let's say you're to translate the word water from English into, say, Romanian, and you were to say, well, water means apa. And then, 500 years from now, we were to say water we'll translate it with a different word. We'll say water means something else. We're not talking about anything other than water here. We're using the same word, water, but what that word means in that different language might change over time, depending on the culture and the folks who are doing the translation. And I think that's what we see here with Pesach. So Pesach has always been translated in English, like I said, as Passover, or to pass over, to leap over. But the Septuagint which is again about 1,100 years older than the oldest Hebrew copy of the Masoretic, they don't translate it as to pass over. They translate it as to protect or to cover. So I want to read that the Septuagint passage of Exodus 12, chapter 12, verses 12 through 13. And I will pass through the land of Egypt on this night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human being to animal. And on all the gods of the Egyptians I will execute vengeance. I am the Lord. And verse 13. And the blood shall be for you as a sign on the houses where you are. And I will see the blood, and I will protect you, or cover you. And there shall not be a plague among you to destroy whenever I strike the land of Egypt. Now, in comparison, the Masoretic on that same verse says, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And so for those who aren't familiar with translations and these distinctions, we have universally here, there's one word, that's Pesach in Hebrew, and there's going to be some sort of equivalent in Greek, and there'll be some sort of equivalent translation in English. The word isn't different from one to the next. It's the translation, or the understanding of what that word means that we're discussing.
Yeah, last night, whenever I was doing a little bit more research into this too, I had heard this before and couldn't remember where I'd heard it. Oddly enough, it actually was Dr. Heiser. I was looking into some old research that he had done, and it was actually all the way back in 2019. He did an episode as he was going through Exodus verse by verse. So anybody who's never checked it out, he has a podcast. He has since passed on, but he has a podcast still up today, and it's called the Naked Bible Podcast. There is last time I looked, it was like 450 episodes of just straight biblical studies. It's really good stuff. So you guys should definitely check that out. It was episode 270, I believe, but he actually goes into a lot of this in detail. About how, he actually said that until the 5th century AD, that's actually where we see the term Pesach actually begin to be used as to skip over or pass over. The main translation that started using to skip over or to pass over was the actual Latin Vulgate. So that is the Latin translation, which is really interesting. I think that's actually where we know that the KJV, right, the King James, that was made very popular here in America. That is that's actually a translation, the Latin Vulgate, that it will lean on a lot of times. It'll lean on the Latin Vulgate. It'll lean on the Masoretic and the Greek manuscripts there that they had discovered at that time.
Well, there's something interesting too about what you said, because if you're familiar with, for any of those out there that are familiar with sort of rabbinic history, you know, around almost 1,000 years ago, this guy named Rashi, and Rashi was very well respected rabbi, and he had sort of made a comment on this term of Pesach, and his comment was, well, it just means to pass over. That's what it means. Simple as that, you know. But again, this would be around 500 years after what Brent was just mentioning, you know. And so you have to look at these things in context, you know, as we have access now in the present to more data in on our phones and within our pockets than Rashi had access to during his entire lifetime. And now it's not discounting or discrediting anything that Rashi ever said. He's a brilliant and very wise man. It's just he didn't have access to what we do, and so with that, we are able to make come to different conclusions. And so I wanted to say that, yeah, you know, around the time of the 1st century and back, and this word Pesach didn't mean the same thing. And I'm going to show you that. We're going to get to it where we're going to discuss the Greek words used here. This word in Greek, where we get a translation that's used in the New Testament and what it means there. It's really interesting. But yeah, I think it's important to realize that the word Pesach has never changed. That's what the word is in the Hebrew, just what we know that to mean. So I want to go a little bit further here, and so I'm gonna give you that word in the Greek here in the story of Exodus, chapter 12, verse 13. This is your Septuagint, so the Greek translation, right? The word that in 300 years prior to Christ, the word that they used to translate Passover into the Greek was a word called skepazo. Skepazo literally means to cover, as in to protect. It doesn't mean to leap over. It means to stand over, to cover over, for the purpose of protection. So this was the Greek word that these 70 rabbis came together and agreed upon, that this is what Pesach means. So later on, we might have people agree on something different, but I think that it's fair to say that the Septuagint here at least has some major role to play in understanding what this means. Now, there are other things called targums, which we won't really get into any of them today. Targums are commentaries written in Aramaic. These are called targums. And what's special and what's important about those is targums are, again, a time where you see folks coming together to write a translation. These folks who are living prior to Christ. And what's important about that is they're not influenced by divisions within Christianity and Judaism. These guys are living in Babylon, and they're writing commentary in Aramaic about the Torah, and that means that they're using words in another language that we are aware of the definitions. And they also agree here with the Greek, which is that this word Pesach really does mean to cover, to protect, and a few other things that we'll get into. And so I wanted to show something very interesting in the Hebrew for those who are really want to see this show up in the Hebrew, where we see differences in the Masoretic tradition, right? So the Hebrew tradition, where Pesach will not mean to leap over or to pass over. It will literally mean something else. And so the first example we have is in 1 Kings 18, verse 21, and I want to read that real quick to you. And this is the story about Elijah and the prophets of Baal or Baal. And so in verse 21 it says, "And Elijah came to all the people and said, until sorry, I'm reading this from the Hebrew here. Until when you falter, how long will you falter between two opinions? If Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh is God, then follow him. But if Baal, follow him. But not answered the people to him a word. So they didn't say anything. They didn't say a word. Okay. So in this passage, we actually have a variant of the Pesach word. It's called posechim, right? It comes from Pesach. And so it's the word where we often see it translated to stumble or to falter or hesitate between two opinions, right there in the verse. Excuse me. So often you'll see. One second, I'm gonna pull this word up here. Posechim. Yeah. So the NAS has it. How long will you hesitate between two opinions? The King James has how long will you halt ye between two opinions? And so here's a question here. This is a word that we were told up until now in the Hebrew means, to pass over or to leap or to dance or to jump or to some movement. This is defining it as the exact opposite of that. It's the absence of movement, hesitation, halting, faltering. Some will say stumble. And what's interesting is if you go up just a few verses later in 1 Kings, again, chapter 18, verse 26, you're going to see the same word show up again. And here they're going to translate it differently again. So they took the bull which was given to them and prepared it. They called on the name of Baal from morning and until evening, saying, Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. Again, this is Waipasehu, right? This is, again, from the same root word, Pesach. And they decide to use, even though a few verses earlier they say this means to hesitate or to halt or to not move, now they have to go back and use the same tradition, which is it must mean to leap. So they're leaping around the altar, maybe whooping and hollering and sort of making fools of themselves. I would argue here, and we'll talk about this maybe another time, but that this very well mean that no one answered and they're standing around the altar not knowing what to do. It doesn't need to mean that they leaped and they leapt around the altar. But so I think what we have to see is there's some contention within one chapter, within a few passages in the book of Kings, 1 Kings, where the translators are using a completely different word in the English to translate the same root word in Hebrew. And so there's serious conflict as to what this word means. The Masoretic in 2 Samuel chapter 4, verse 4, this is a story where we hear about Jonathan, the son of Saul, and how he became crippled or lame, right? And so in the passage it reads, he was 5 years old when the news about Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him and fled. And as she fled in her haste, he fell and became lame. This word here, lame, is again from the root word Pesach, and it literally just means to stand still, right? To hesitate, to not move. And so I think it becomes very interesting when we start to see, these definitions using the same word opposing each other. And why does any of this matter? That English translators at one point used a word this way, and the later point they used it to mean the opposite. Well, it's going to really influence our understanding of what's going on within the text of the actual Passover back in the Exodus. And we're going to see something come to life here that I think will really shed light on what's going on in the text. And I hope that it will really help those who are studying the text to see what God is doing, and it's fascinating. But before we go on, Brent, if you have anything, go for it.
Yeah,
I'm changing directions at this point, so go for it.
Okay, awesome. So there's one more passage that I wanted to take everybody to, where the actual word itself, Pesach, is used in the Old Testament scriptures here. It's not a variant. It is quite literally the word Pesach. And if you go to Isaiah 31, verse 5, in the ESV, it reads like this: like birds hovering, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and deliver it. He will spare and rescue it. So the word spare there in the text is actually the exact word Pesach. Most translations, if you look through your English translations, they're actually going to put Passover there. But if you look in the context of the passage, if you remove that understanding of skipping over and passing over, it actually makes a lot more sense. Let me read it like this, because what we're really arguing is that Pesach should be more understood. Danny, correct me if I'm wrong, but it should be more understood as standing over in a guarding position or protecting.
Yep. And you can see where the confusion comes from, or the not the confusion, but the movement in the definition came from, because I say shelter, to shelter for the purpose of protection. Yeah, to stand over. In the story about the prophets of Baal, he said you've got 1 foot in the camp of Baal, and you've got 1 foot in the camp of Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, and you're sort of standing there straddling 2 things, and you're not moving, and that's not acceptable. Choose one, right? But the word there, you're sort of standing over 2 different choices, and you've not made one. And so I think you're exactly right. I think it means to stand over in a posture, and not move, to not be moving. And so, and in that sense, we see this in, I believe it's in, I've got it here, Psalm 91, verse 14. I will shelter him, for he knew my name. We see Isaiah 50. These are all in the Septuagint. Isaiah 51:16. It reads, "Under the shadow of my hand, I will shelter you." Even there in the Masoretic, we'll see that he has it. They translate the Isaiah 51:16 as, "With the shadow of my hand, I have covered you." So there, they actually get pretty close to the Septuagint reading. But all of these are basically saying the same thing. They're implying that something's not moving at all. That there's some sort of halt in movement. Some will call it lame, or you're not making any decisions. You're hesitant. But it's all coming to this point here that something is not moving. It's standing, it's stopping, it's between 2 things, it's hovering over. And in that, it can be understood as to protect, to cover, to shadow over, a few of these different things it could mean. Now, what does that benefit us? And so what I would like to do is read the Exodus account with those definitions in place. And go ahead.
Oh, yeah, 1 second before we go on. Actually, you hit on something right here that's in that Isaiah passage. You said it's actually like standing in one spot. Some use it as being caught between 2 or just not moving at all. If you look at this Isaiah 31:5, it says, "Like birds hovering, so the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem." Well, if they're hovering, they're in one spot. You see that?
Right.
The Lord of hosts is actually hovering in one spot over who? Well, over Jerusalem. This is who he's going to protect. That is quite literally what the passage says. So the Lord of hosts will protect Jerusalem as he stands over them. He will actually stand on guard over them and rescue them.
Absolutely. It's exactly what we're pointing to these passages to paint this picture that something is happening in the Passover story, right? And again, by reflex, called the Passover story, that should help us see something different. And so what happens when we let the word Pesach mean what its authors intended it to mean by opting for what these Septuagint translators have used to define it? We'll see Yehovah, Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, come down to destroy. He comes to execute judgment on everyone, so humans, animals, even the gods of Egypt. They're a target of his judgment. So God himself is exacting this judgment. And what we start to see is he's doing this both as the destroyer and the protector. It becomes very interesting. And so we see that when he sees the blood of this spotless lamb upon the home, he stands over the home, not allowing the destroyer to come into the home. But the question is, how can God come so close to humanity without killing them? And what do I mean by that? We see God telling Moses, "No man can see my face and live." right? We see this happening in the text. We see that when the man comes to, if you're familiar with the story, when the man comes to sort of study the ark of the covenant because it starts to wobble, he puts his hand up to steady the ark and he drops dead. God is not us. We are not him. And he lives in a space in which humanity cannot survive. We are imperfect. We are flawed. And in that, we have, how do I put it in basic terms? When we sin in the garden, right? When Adam sins, and he's now separated from God. Like God immediately begins to distance himself from humanity. And the more sin that enters into humanity, the more distance God is giving to humanity. So if you look at it like this, God walks with Adam in the cool of the day in the garden. There's sin, and then all of a sudden God is kicking him out of the garden. Soon God speaks to Adam, but they're not walking in close proximity. And then once you get down the road, God doesn't even speak to people directly. He'll use a prophet or he'll use a messenger. And what we start to see is the more sin that is in humanity as a whole, right? The further apart we are from God. And what am I trying to say? That sin separates us. God is holy, he's perfect. We, on the other hand, are not. And so if God comes into our space, we drop dead. We can't, it's like touching plutonium. There's a certain procedure and way to get close to God, and then there's anything else. And if you violate those terms of God's holiness, it kills. It would kill us, right? We cannot exist in the same place. Our physical bodies cannot exist in the same place. So what does God do? He wants to come down to Egypt and rescue them. And so what he has them do is he has them put the blood of this spotless lamb on the doorpost. So what we start to see is this picture being painted where God stands over the doorway, and we'll read this in just a minute, where God stands over the doorway of each and every home, and it's sort of like he's putting out his hand saying, death cannot enter here, destruction cannot enter here. But the question must be asked, how could God interact so closely with humanity without humanity just being destroyed by the fact that he's there? But that's where the blood comes in. Blood is throughout the entire Old Testament and New Testament, blood is symbolic of something. Humanity breaks God's covenant. They break God's commandments. They sin, right? We talked about this in previous episodes. They sin against God. And that transgression requires death. It requires some price to be paid. And in this case, God provides them the opportunity to take the life of a pure and spotless animal, as insufficient as that is, that will temporarily serve as a symbolic death that will separate, that will cover humanity's sin so that God can be close, right? So think about it like this. You have humanity living inside the house. You have the blood that is on the doorpost of the home, and then God stands over it, blocking death. And that close proximity is permissible by God because there's blood involved, and that blood is protecting the humanity from the death that would come by being so close to God. And I think what you'll start to see is this salvation happening, this redemption happening, this preservation from death showing up in the story. So I wanted to read it kind of with fresh eyes as we have talked about this for a few minutes. So in Exodus 12, starting in verse 11, we're going to read it like this. Here is how you are to eat it. So he's talking about this lamb. With your belt fastened, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand, you are to eat it hurriedly or quickly. So they're supposed to be ready to go, right? They got the staff in their hand, they got their belt tied, their shoes are on their feet, they're ready to go. It is the Lord's covering or shelter or protection. Another way to interpret the next sentence would be God is standing guard. And then verse 12, for that night I will pass through the land of Egypt and kill the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both men and animals. And I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord, or I am Yehovah. The blood of the lamb will come to be will come to be for you as a sign or an oath or a pledge over the houses where you are. So again, this is a symbolic thing that the people are doing, showing their allegiance and loyalty, a pledge of loyalty to God. When I see the blood, I will stand guard over you, or I will protect you, or cover you, or shelter you, and no plague of destruction will be upon you when I strike the land of Egypt. We're starting to see this take place. Now let's go into verse 21 real quick. Then Moses called all the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and select lambs for yourself according to your clans, and kill this sort of covering or protecting lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel, so the top here, and the two doorposts, the sides, with the blood that is in that basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For Jehovah will pass through to strike the Egyptians. And when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, Jehovah will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer to enter your houses or strike you." Right? So he will pass over the door. This is the traditional reading. What is it saying here? What are we going to rethink that word? Jehovah will stand over the door and not allow the destroyer to enter your houses. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. I'm going to read all the way through 27. And when you come to the land the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, "What do you mean by this service?" Like this celebration. And 27 says, you shall say, "It is a sacrifice of Jehovah's protection," or his covering. "For he stood over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt to protect them when he struck the Egyptians, but spared our homes." And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Right, so this blood of the spotless lamb was this symbolic of their allegiances, their loyalty to God, and their obedience to actually do the thing he told them to do. And it also separated them from their imperfections as human beings when God stood over their homes, their doorways. And so you can see how this blood acts as a protection, as a marker. It keeps them from death. It declares their allegiance to God. It preserves their life, not only from destruction, but also it allows God to stand over them. And so I think what we see is this demonstrable act that's happening, where they must do this. It's not just symbolic. If God is to stand over the doorway of their home to protect them from the destruction that's coming, the blood has to be present or he can't do it, right? Because if he stood over their home, they'd die. So I think there's some really interesting things now that we're starting to see as we go forward, but I want to stop here and see what you got.
Oh no, I think that this is awesome. I think as you actually take the old understanding of just passing over or skipping over, and you replace that with this protective stance, no pun intended there, but protective language here, that it actually shows God being a lot more personally involved, as opposed to just us sacrificing the Passover lamb, which again, this has been sufficient understanding. We're not saying that this has been dangerous understanding or anything like that for hundreds of years, but this has been sufficient. But there's so much more richness in the text here. We actually have Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh himself standing over our homes because of this innocent blood that was shed, right? Mm-hmm. Standing over and protecting us as opposed to just passing over us.
Right. Yeah. He's an active participant in the redemption, in the preservation, and I think when you see that and you start to see the New Testament implications of this story, you realize that what's happening here becomes pretty phenomenal. I wanted to read one quick passage, sort of to bring this all together. Something that this is not a biblical passage. This is sort of a summary that I put together, and I'll make this document available as well. I'll put these all on this share drive, this Google Drive, where you can access it if you're interested. So this last paragraph, it says, this event was a great foreshadowing of a future redemption of mankind from our enslavement to sin, as demonstrated through our inability to uphold God's commandments, or the Torah. Our redemption came by the death of the Passover lamb, our Messiah, Yeshua. God demonstrated his unmerited mercy by coming as a man, this word of the Lord, the Shekinah of God, who tabernacled amongst us. He took on humanity so that by keeping Torah perfectly, he could be the perfect Passover lamb. He was blameless, he was spotless, and his blood would be shed and would serve as our covering for those who call upon the name of the Lord. He would stand over us and protect us from death. Having his blood guarding over us, we are marked now for salvation on that great day of atonement that is to come. Now belonging to God, we can ascend freely to the mountain of God, being filled with the Ruach HaKodesh, and we can take our place as B'nai Elohim, as the sons of God, and a kingdom of priests, bringing the good news of God to the world. And I wanted to say that, the purpose of this Passover, right? That God doesn't do anything just without any intention. God was covering them, protecting them from death for a reason, and he was doing that so that he could bring his people to his holy mountain and teach them his ways. And his goal was stated; it was obvious. If you read the Passover story, if you continue reading, the Exodus story, what you're going to find out is he called all of them to ascend the mountain. He was going to make them a nation of priests. They refused. They were too afraid. They said, "We're afraid. We're going to die." And so he let them create a priesthood, right? These sons of Aaron. So the whole nation was going to be a kingdom of priests for the whole world, to bring the ways of God to all of humanity. But God said, "Okay, well, you're not ready yet. I got plan B. Instead of making you an entire nation of priests, we'll make within you a priesthood, and that priesthood will slowly but surely bring the nation to where it should be." This was the intention. And so what we see happening, about 1400 years later, when the Messiah shows up, when he's taken by the soldiers, and he's taken in front of the Sanhedrin, the ruling body. He's taken by the priests, and he's and the high priest, and they're investigating him. He's taken to Pilate, and they're investigating him. They're combing through his life to see if they can find fault with him. And what do we find? With the Messiah, who's taken like a lamb to the slaughter, we find that he's perfect. He's spotless. He's without blemish. And he's killed on Passover at twilight, just like the Passover lamb. And what do we see 50 days later? And what we saw 50 days later in the Old Testament foreshadowing was that they came to Sinai and God gave them the Torah. What we see 50 days later is Shavuot happening again in Jerusalem. We call it Pentecost, where God brought his Ruach HaKodesh, his Holy Spirit, and he poured it out on humanity. And when we see these things, these great foreshadowings, it should help us to pause and stop and take stock. And one, we are watching and hopefully participating in one of the greatest orchestrated moments in human history. If we can't stop and just let our hair be blown back for a minute at like how incredible God is, and showing, and also gracious, and showing us what he's going to do, without revealing to the adversary how he's going to do it. So enough so that when we see it, we can recognize it. And God his genius is so evident in these stories, and that's why as Christians we might say, what do we need with those biblical holidays? What do they even matter? I can assure you, you won't see the complexity and the beauty of God in his hand throughout human history if you're not paying attention to these. Go ahead. Talk.
Oh no, you said hand right there. This is something that I wanted to bring up today. Um, I actually, that video that you sent me, it is Passover the right translation, right?
Yeah.
They said something so key in that video that you just touched on. It's not that we as Christians, we as followers of Yeshua, Jesus, have to obey these feasts and festivals. It is rather we have been invited to participate in
Yeah.
these feasts in remembrance of what he's done. Um, but I just wanted to throw that in there because
Yeah.
you'd mentioned not having to follow them exactly. But
I remember hearing some years ago, there's a guy's name is Rabbi Manis Friedman. He's not messianic. He's a Chabad rabbi. He's a very, very wise man. I really like him. And he talks about Shabbat or Sabbath. And he talks about, he's like, and this is, again, he's speaking primarily to a Jewish audience. And one of the things he says about it is really fascinating. He talks about God and our relationship with him. It's as a proximity thing. And he says, how do you know you're as close to someone as you can possibly be? And you can see if you're as close as you can be because you can look at that person and see if other things are closer. And also maybe more important and of more value. And so if you look at God and he's, let's say the door's closed and God's not making an invitation to you, you realize you've come as close as you can. But however, if you were to look at God and he were to be making an invitation for you to participate in something with him, to draw closer, then there is room for you to get close to God. And when you realize that that's what things like, Passover, and Shabbat are, or Sabbath are, these are invitations by God to get closer. This is not some sort of self-righteous thing. You can't be redeemed by what you do. That's end of story. There's nothing you can do to earn your way towards some sort of salvation or redemption from your mistakes. It's impossible. But having been redeemed, we should be in a process, we call it sanctification, this process of growing nearer in proximity to God. And God has given us this open invitation to observe and to celebrate these days that are so meaningful to him. And so with that open invitation, why not? Again, it's not like you become holier than someone else because they don't. It's not about that. It's about growing nearer to God and to understanding who he is, to understanding more about his character, and to understand more about what he expects from us. And that's, as far as this podcast goes, that's what we're looking for. How do we know those things? How do we understand who God is and what he expects of us?
yeah, the more we dive into the history of the feast, the actual, I mean, even just touching on Pesach, Passover here so far, look at the richness that we've gained about what it was foreshadowing our Messiah as being our protector, our Passover lamb, which protective lamb, we would argue, I guess, at this point. But it's so amazing to actually see why God actually said, keep these feasts. And when it's interesting, every single time he tells them to keep a feast, he says, and when your children ask, right? So he's actually indicating your children are going to ask you about this every time you do it. And this is what you tell them. So you're already building that trust rooted obedience, right? In your children, that faith. You're showing them every single year over and over. This is where God was faithful here. This is where he was faithful here. And you're just constantly building that. You're constantly cultivating the ground inside of them. So whenever they have all these seeds of the word dropped into them, it can take root and grow. But yet there was a reason for all of this. And to be invited now, as the Gentiles that we are, to be invited into this and to be able to know God on this level, to see his faithfulness that brought about even our inclusion into this tree, right? We've been grafted into the root. It is just amazing that it's baffling almost sometimes that we have watered this down to an argument of, oh, well, do we have to do it?
Yeah.
It's not about that. We get to. You've been invited to. The
Yeah.
God of the universe is inviting you to eat with him,
Yeah.
basically.
Well, we've been grafted in as, you know, I heard this said before, and I love, I can't remember exactly where I heard it from, but I love it. You know, because there's all this, you see this idea of like replacement theology in some churches. We're like, no, we're Israel now. The current state of Israel means nothing, and you know, we are the church. That's insanity to me, because that means God breaks his promises, and he can do that with them. He could do that with us. We have, as Paul said, been grafted in, as you said just a minute ago, been grafted in. We do not replace Israel. We expand Israel. We have been, we are now, you know, citizens, spiritually speaking. We are, with that though comes not just benefits, but it comes responsibilities. You know, what does it mean to be the people of God, or for us to be grafted in to the people of God? What does that mean? Is it, you know, we now have on our shoulders the responsibility of representing his name, and making sure we uplift his name. You know, and especially when it comes to things like simple things like arguing with amongst ourselves about, you know, theology and interpreting things and whatnot. You know, we have to remember at all times to whom we belong, and who we are being reflections of. And people are always watching everything that we do, and so we have to make sure that we are, as a grafted in people, we have to always remember that we are now reflecting God in everything that we do and say. And I wanted to say one thing, if we have a minute. I wanted to read one little passage out of Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 through 29. I think it's so important, and I don't have a lot. We don't have a lot of time this time to go into the background of it. But I wrote something, and it's in this document. Again, I'll make it available if anybody sends an email to me. We can get you a copy, or we can give you access to these documents. And they're basically just studies that were, you know, that are like more in the weeds. So for anybody who wants to look at this and go a little further, you can always ask for request access, and we'll give it to you. So in Galatians chapter 3, verses 23 through 29, and I'm saying this here with some commentary added, because this passage is a passage that so many people have heard or read and been confused by. And this is Paul talking to a mixed group of believers in Galatia. And he's describing some things to them about this sort of new age wherein the Messiah has now come, and what that means. And so I know a lot of people use this as sort of a proof text for some crazy theologies, but I want you guys to hear this in context of what we've been talking about, within context of the Passover. And so I'll go slowly, and I've added some commentary in the document that I made. That all the commentary that's added here is highlighted, so you can see what it's sort of just basically breaking down a complex word or phrase into what the thought is behind Paul's discussion here. So here we go, verse 23. Now before the time of faithfulness came. So time here meaning era or age. Of faithfulness meaning loyal obedience. So this is Paul saying prior to the Messiah, prior to the time where our loyal obedience, this age came, prior to that. So before the Messiah, we were imprisoned under the law. Now, what does that mean? That you know, we're imprisoned under Torah. What in the world does that mean? And that the Torah, being perfect, through that we were held captive. How? Its perfection exposes our weakness and thus our guilt, right? So we were imprisoned in our own guilt. Because Torah is perfect and it just reveals to us our imperfections, in that now we're held prisoner or held captive. And it continues, we were therefore kept under guard. Now, one might read that in a negative sense. That's not what this means. We're protected by the temporary provision of atonement. We were kept, protected, under guard, under protection of this atonement sacrifice within the sacrificial system that allowed humanity to not be destroyed. So, for example, if there were no sacrificial system up until the death of the Messiah, if there no sacrificial system, we'd all be dead, right? There would be no Israel. They would have been wiped out. So this system within the Torah, so this piece of the Torah, which was the sacrificial system, it's a small part, it's a part, a very important part, but it's not the entirety of the Torah. This piece, the sacrificial system, it kept Israel, it kept the people of God through the system of atonement, right? So it protected them until this yet to come time of loyal obedience would be realized, right? So until the realization or the fulfillment of this time where this new time of our faithfulness, right, and our loyalty to God would come to fruition. Accordingly, the Torah, meaning its sacrificial system for atonement, functioned as a custodian or a placeholder until the time of the Messiah came, so that we might be declared righteous on the grounds of our loyal obedience. What does that mean again? So we're no longer declared righteous as we always have been. We are declared righteous through our loyal obedience, right? This is not salvation. We're not talking about salvation here. We're talking about righteousness. But now that the time or this age or this new era for this loyal obedience has come, we are no longer under the custodian, right? So the placeholder. What's the placeholder? The old sacrificial system. That sacrificial system no longer is necessary. Is Paul saying the Torah is no longer necessary? Murder's okay? Of course he's not saying that. He's talking specifically about the sacrificial system for atonement. It's no longer necessary. Why isn't it? Because the Messiah came, the perfect lamb, right? No longer is it necessary for the placeholder of animal blood. God has provided himself as the sacrifice. So
That's awesome.
And I wanted to, we'll finish up here real quick. So I'm going to finish up these few passages. So the system is no longer necessary for atonement. So for in our union with the Messiah, you are all now sons of God, or B'nai Elohim, through your loyal obedience. For as many as were immersed in the Messiah, some might say baptized, right? In that his death was on our behalf, having clothed yourselves with the Messiah. Right, protected from death. This clothe yourself with Messiah, is that same word, right? That same word that we talked about earlier, the skepazo in the Greek. This is the same word that Paul is using, being clothed in the Messiah, as the Septuagint is using, talking about the protection provided, covering provided by the blood of the Lamb in the Passover story. So Paul is using the same language here. Now we are protected from death by the blood of the Lamb, in whom the Messiah, there is no Jew or Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor male nor female. Now I want you to see that this is a reflection here. There's no longer Jew nor Gentile. What did we see happen in the Passover story? When God had redeemed them out of the land, they were protected again by the blood of the perfect Lamb. They were redeemed out of the land of Egypt. There's no longer Israel or Israelite or Egyptian. They're all now the people of God. So this is a foreshadowing of what he's going to do. He grafts in the Egyptians who declare their loyalty to God through the use of the blood of the Lamb. He declares them now as part of Israel, right? The people of God. Same with us. Those who apply the blood of the Lamb of God, the Messiah, upon our hearts, we are no longer Goyim or Gentiles. We are grafted in as now part of the people of Israel, the same way the Egyptians were. And
Uh,
go ahead.
oh no, you keep tracking.
And he finishes out like this. And if you belong to the Messiah, you are the seed or the offspring of Abraham and the heirs according to the promise or the covenant. So you can see how Paul might be thinking about the Pesach in its truest sense, right? Of that of being clothed in the Messiah or the blood of our Passover lamb. So really wanted to finish that out there as far as the notes that I have, just to bring it home to see how even in the New Testament, Paul is tracking right along with this idea, being clothed, being covered with the blood of the Lamb, how it's our protection, how it marks us as belonging to God.
I wasn't aware of that usage of that word in Galatians at all, actually, before you just read that. That was really neat. That kind of stuff gets me excited, obviously. One thing I wanted to look at was Exodus 12, and we're going to actually look at verse 6. It says, "And you shall keep it," meaning the lamb, "until the 14th day of this month." That's very interesting right there, because the number 14 in Hebrew can mean a lot of things, but it's also the very word for hand.
Right.
So as we're talking about God standing over and protecting, and you actually did it earlier in the video. I don't even know if you were aware, but you said he's standing over and protecting. He's putting his hand up saying you can't enter here, right? We were talking about us being one in Christ now with that passage in Galatians. You going through that made me think of this. It's interesting that Yeshua, our Messiah, actually says this in the New Testament, in the Gospels, where he says, who the Father has given me, no one can snatch out of my hand.
Right.
We are all one in that mighty hand of Yeshua, the mighty hand that reached out to protect and destroy in the Exodus story, now holds us all together in one unison.
Well, so if you want to, for those that are interested in this sort of thing, we'll probably dedicate a whole series to this, I would imagine. And there have been people who have done an excellent job. If you really want to get in the academic, sort of get into the weeds with it, we'll probably give overviews about this idea of, should I do it?
Do it.
Okay. We're going to take like 30 seconds here, and I want to talk about, because I think it really, this will be a jumping off point for us at a future episode. So I want to be brief and okay. So there's this idea within Christianity, a term, not an idea, a term within Christianity called the Trinity. This idea of God is three persons. Okay. The concept is not a Christian concept. There's very much a biblical understanding that God exists in various forms. But God is echad. He's one. He is just one. When we're talking about God specifically, Yud He Vav He, Yehovah or Yahweh, some might say. He is echad. He is one. There aren't three gods, right? We have one God. But God, who sits upon the throne, he cannot be seen by mankind, or else man would die. He is seated on the throne, high and lifted up. But when he wants to interact with humanity in a way as to not kill us, he does so by coming as a man, or coming looking like a man. In the Old Testament, we see this earlier. Again, this might sound controversial, but this is something that I am not the first person to talk about. There's a lot of amazing literature out there on this, and Brent's over there getting excited because this is a fascinating subject. But I just want to make it super clear, and then we'll talk about it another time. But when God decides to show up as a interactive God, a God who can be seen by human beings without them dying, he clothes himself in humanity. Right. So in the Old Testament, we see this occurring where you have like maybe a term called the word of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, the malach of God, Think about the story where Abraham is sitting there beside this tent, and it says the angel of the Lord shows up, and it's like three guys show up. There's two guys who are on either side, and then the one in the middle is described as Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, but looks like a guy, looks like a man. Speaks to him, touches him, interacts with him. It's physical in nature. When Jacob is wrestling with the angel of the Lord, they're fighting. They're physically fighting. There's physical touch. There's no wings. There's no halos. None of that exists. Looks just like a person. And we find this throughout the entire Old Testament. We have this description. And so I just want to say this briefly and quickly. So when God wants to interact with humanity in a very physical way, he shows up in a physical form. In the Old Testament, he shows up temporarily. He comes and then he leaves. In the New Testament, the word of the Lord became flesh and dwelt among us. John describes that to us, the entire New Testament. That it gives us these descriptions of the Shekinah, the manifested glory of God came as a man, born of a woman, lived amongst us, took on our sin, and then died for us, and then rose. But the point being here that God came in physical form. If God wants to show up and dwell within people, or act in some spiritual sense, he comes as the Ruach, the Spirit of God. All of these do not deviate from the reality that God is Echad. There's only one. He can just show up however he wants to show up. If he wants to show up and interact with human beings without killing all of us, he shows up as a man. If he wants to show up and dwell within someone, he can show up as the Spirit. It's all him. He's not changing. He has and so what is important about this is there are many terms used for when God shows up. And again, one of those is the hand, the right hand, his right hand, which is why we see the idea of Yeshua, or Jesus, sitting down at the right hand of God. He is the right hand of God. He is God's, he is that which God uses to interact with humanity, his right hand. And so, we'll talk someday maybe about the Shekinah, the glory of God. We'll get into all that stuff about how, what that means in Hebrew, God manifesting himself, the fullness or the manifested representative of God showing up. We'll talk about that. I think it's fascinating. And I think a lot of people have done it well. I have not found anybody who's done it sort of all encompassing. So maybe we'll do it again, like 30,000 feet. But maybe that'll be the next one we talk about. Who knows? But I think what's valuable is that when we look at this Passover story and how does this relate? When we see this Passover story, we see God in Exodus 12 saying that he himself is coming as a destroyer. We also say that he himself is protecting. So he's both destroying and protecting at the same time. So what's going on there? Some fascinating things we'll maybe have more time next week to get into. Go ahead, talk.
Oh yeah, no, you saw me going crazy over here. This has got to be. I was actually wondering last night as I was listening to some stuff. Me and my wife were looking at some Passover stuff last night too, listening to Heiser's stuff. I was just wondering how we were going to get through this without mentioning something around the angel of the Lord. It's just inescapable in the passage whenever you really break it down. And like Daniel said, we're gonna do a deep dive on this eventually. We have to. The seeing what he just described in a very brief monologue there is something that has been so monumental for me, looking at scripture, realizing what's going on, really opening up my Bible to me. And once people get this, we have to do it, because once people get that, there will be no more, we don't need that Old Testament. We have the new. For that erases that divide for me. You start seeing Jesus, he took on flesh. You start seeing him in your Old Testament in a way that you never had before. You realize that the passage, I always like to say this, the passage in the New Testament that John actually brings up, where he says, he came to his own, and his own did not receive him. Well, that's not the first time he came to his own. Right. And that's just a little break from there.
I want to throw this out there, because what you said I want to make sure people realize when we read the stories about the angel of the Lord or the Malach of God or Yahweh or Yud-Heh-Vav or Yehovah, however you want to say it. The reason I say however you want to say it is because there's different people say it differently, and we're going to respect everybody and how they say it. But what I want to say that's really important here is that when you read your New Testament, when you read the story of the gospel, I don't want you to, when you read your Old Testament stories, right? So, and you see the angel of the Lord, this is not Jesus. Jesus is not in your Old Testament. Straightforward. Jesus does not exist. Yeshua, meaning the physical incarnation of God who was born of a woman, who lived for 33 years and then died, does not exist in the Old Testament. However, who was Yeshua? He was the Word of God. The we'll talk about. Well, I'll get into it later more later. He was the angel of the Lord or the Word of the Lord who is just a physical representation of God. He is the Shekinah of God. I guess we'll get into it a little bit now. God manifested himself, right? His Shekinah means, in Greek we have doxa, which really just means like glory or praise or glorious or some sort of it has a connection with one's reputation, like praiseworthy. There's a few things. Shekinah in Hebrew is where we often translate the glory, is not related in any sense to just in the sense of one's, praiseworthiness. Shekinah means a manifestation of the fullness of God in a visible form. So God would show up as something physical, even though God is seated on a throne, cannot be seen. He's making a way for the invisible God to be seen and interacted with. He's providing us a means to interact with him. Someone who will come, who is God, but looks like a person, so we can interact and have conversation. We can discuss things. He can tell us what, like for example, Ezekiel, the word of the Lord comes to Ezekiel and he tells Ezekiel what's going on and what not to do and what he should be doing. He's talking for God as a man. It's in the word of the Lord. And so what I want us to see is that when we read our New Testament, when we see God as the word of the Lord showing up, Emmanuel, God with us, the word of the Lord showing up in human flesh. He gets a name, Yeshua. He's our salvation. He's Jesus, right? But don't read Jesus back in the Old Testament because you'll miss something valuable. Read the word of the Lord into the New. Realize that reading Jesus in the Old Testament is to personify with the name Jesus, the Messiah, into the Old Testament. What I want you to do is realize that the angel of the Lord is just God in his fullness showing up in a way that we can see. Jesus is that too. Yeshua is the salvation of God. Yeshua literally means salvation. Yeshua is the salvation of God showing up in human flesh. It is God with us. And so what I'm saying is we don't want to take the name of Jesus and put it in the Old Testament because it will skew in sort of a Christian way how to interpret what's happening in the Old. But if we look at God with us when we read our New Testament, we're going to realize that every single place that Yeshua went, that Jesus went, this is God showing up. This is Yud-Heh-Vav showing up as a man. And when you see that, I mean, every single story will explode in meaning. When he gives himself, well, we're talking about Passover. What on earth does that mean when God presents himself to die on behalf? I mean, do we really get what's happening when we see Yeshua dying? This is God as a man dying for us. So I guess why I just want to clarify that when we look at these passages, don't read the new into the old, read the old into the new with that clarification of who Jesus really was, being of utmost importance. Brent.
Yeah, no. One way that I always like to term it, because it's so we get this Christianese speak, right? We get Jesus, we get the Son, the Father, the Holy Spirit. All these terms have distinct meanings, and they kind of get jumbled together sometimes as we talk about them. One of the best ways I've figured out to describe what you've been talking about is not reading Jesus back into the Old Testament. Is to simply ask a very small question, and that question is Jesus eternal? Yes, that's very easy to answer. Now, did he exist as Jesus always? That's an earthly name given, kind of like what you touched on there, right?
Yeah.
He was given the name Yeshua, which means salvation. But the Son is eternal. And that's what I always like to say is if you're going to look for Jesus in the Old Testament, try to think of it as looking for the Son, because he was always eternal. He has always been. And so that's always kind of cleared it up for me, is to not say, let's find Jesus back here. But okay, if the Son is eternal and we see how he has interacted with us in the flesh, can we find something similar to that in the Old Testament? And that's
Right.
that's where it really comes alive for me.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be probably some lengthy episodes, and I look forward to them because I feel like there's so much here that it's like holding back the racing dogs right now. We just want to go talk about this, but I think we need to give it its due time, and maybe we can talk about this, in the next episode. If I think because we could talk about Passover forever. I think. If anyone has any interesting questions they'd like to put forward regarding Passover, do them, and we can always come back and talk about them. But maybe we'll if I'm sort of saying this live here, well, pre-recorded, you can always cut it. But if you want to talk about the word of the Lord, the angel of the Lord, starting next week, we can always get into that. I think we do need to lay that down soon, though, because you're okay. We need to lay that down soon because it's going to be so valuable to future conversations.
Yeah, there's so many topics that me and you have already discussed, even just with original sin, with different things like that, where I've been hard pressed to not drop a little comment here and there, like, "Hey, look at this! This explains it so much."
Yeah.
Like you're saying, this is a whole suitcase of material that we're talking about here that we've just briefly discussed. So don't be scared off by it. Don't be off put. There is some very good exegetical, hermeneutical stuff here that we will look at and explain this in further detail. But like you said, this deserves an entire episode, possibly a series, because this is just all through the entire text of the Bible, and it's been staring at us in plain sight this whole time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so how about let's close this one out, and then next week we'll attempt to get into the word of the Lord or the angel of the Lord.
Awesome.
All right. You want to lead us in prayer, or you want me to?
Yeah, I got it. Yebereka ka Adonai vaish mereka, Yair Adonai penaveleka vehuneka, Yasa Adonai penaveleka vayasimleka shalom. The Lord bless you and keep you, make his face to shine upon you. May he be gracious to you, lift up his countenance upon you, and give you his peace, his shalom. In Hashem Yeshua. Amen.